All right. Well, should we get started? What do you think?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I will say welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're so glad that you're here. I want to say thank you to Bookwoman for hosting this event tonight, and I want to be sure to let you all know that if you're interested in buying the books that we're talking about tonight, that you can order them from Bookwoman. So please support your local feminist bookstore. You can go to the website at ebookwoman.com or stop by the store on North Lamar in Austin.
And I want to say that Bookwoman is an icon for Austin. Everybody should, if you're not from here, it's been around as long as I've been in Austin, which is over 30 years. So it's really a tremendous asset for our city.
45 years they've been here.
45 years. We'll
That's
see.
awesome. Yeah.
Hi, Susan. Hi, Susan Allen. Good to see you.
So as we get started, we'll be glad to answer questions at the end. So if you wouldn't mind putting your questions in the Q&A, and that way we'll be able to find them because I'm not going to be able to keep track of the chat. So please put them in the little Q&A box that's along the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end. So I'm Fontaine Yetmen. I'm going to introduce my friend and co-presenter. Claudia Fontaine Chidester was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and attended U.S. military-funded schools. This is all very relevant, as you're going to find out shortly, until the family moved to Guadalajara, Mexico during her high school years. She earned her degree in art history from Wellesley College and pursued her passion for art research while working at the Smith College Library. Later, she earned a master's degree in library and information science from UT Austin. She worked in venture capital and top business research. She founded the Fontaine Archive in Austin, which has collected and organized her parents' rich collection of materials. The archive's first publication, work Standing Up, The Life and Art of Paul Fontaine, came out in 2013 and won the 2014 IBPA Benjamin Franklin Award for Design, that's a big deal. So congratulations. So I'm really excited, Claudia, to be talking about our books with you this evening.
I am as well. I've been looking forward to this conversation for such a long time, and I keep coming up with new questions every time we have a little chat. It's just so much fun. So much more to say. And I just want to say that how we met, John and I met through a mutual friend, Luke Dunlap, who, when he knew what I was writing about, said, "Oh, you must meet John." And so back in a few years ago, we met, and we also had a mutual friend, Jesse Height, actually. And it's been one of these wonderful conversations that we keep coming up with, how our books overlap. And then I'm really glad we came up with this idea to have a live conversation about it. And I want to say a little bit about Jeanne and her background. She received her BA in English from University of Texas at Austin, began her career working as an editorial assistant at the Presto Books in Munich, Germany. And she is also fluent in German, more than I am. A former publisher of Texas Architect, she now works with architects to bring stories about their work to a wider audience. Her writing has been included in Texas Architect, Metropolis, Interior Texas, Austin Home, and the Architect's Newspaper. The first two novels in the Klein Trilogy received the Independent Book Publishers IPPY Book Awards Gold and Silver medals for historical fiction in 2015 and 2018. And this third book, All That Remains, it came out just this last May. So this is wonderful to have you here. And I wanted to say also, when I got a chance to read her books after our introduction, her trilogy is very different from the books that I write, in that it's following a female protagonist through many exciting quasi-criminal investigations, helping the Americans. Also her own life journey of trying to recover from being a German, how the Germans felt. She really does a great job in peeling the onion back on the interior feelings of the Germans that survived the war. And but her book is fiction, and that process was very different than the process that I've gone through using the archive. So, John, why don't you tell us a little bit about how that worked and how you came up with your idea and all that.
Well, what's so great about meeting you is that our books, you're the story of your mother, the book that you wrote, the post World War II adventures of a fearless art advocate, which I love that. That your mother's stomping grounds after the war in 1946 in Germany would really also not only where my books take place, but also where my grandmother and my mother lived at the exact same time. So I feel fairly confident that at some point they must have been like on a streetcar together or something in an art gallery. But my books are inspired by the circumstances of my grandmother and my mother at the end of the war. My mother was 5 years old in 1945. And I had always heard the story about, my grandmother, she could type and she could speak English. And so that was sort of, these were life-saving skills at that time. And she got a job working for an American colonel. She was his secretary. And that was the thing that saved them during that time. And, but I was never really interested in writing a memoir. So I sort of had that kicking around for decades in my head. And then one night I stumbled across the documentary about the Monuments Men on PBS, and I never ever heard of the Monuments Men. And because in my day job I write about architects all the time, and so many of the Monuments Men were architects, I was like, what is this? And I just became sort of obsessed with finding out because I love history. And so I started doing a bunch of research, and one day those two, the circumstances of my family and the idea of the Monuments Men sort of collided. And I thought, oh, that could be a book. So that was, that's where the idea came from. So, and then I started doing a lot of research and, trying to figure out what that world looked like. So, but I know you dealt with, you had all that stuff already when you wrote your book. So, how did you even go about doing that, and what made you start working on that? And also how long it took you, because I think it probably really long.
Well, the content's been building for over 20 years. When my father died in 96, we were handed literally plastic bags of letters, diaries, photo albums, guest books. And being a librarian, of course, I'm very curious, and I wanted to start looking at it. And my first thought was always, I really wanted to promote my father's artwork. That was more in my forefront, not mother's life. But I, at the time, had also started going to a writing workshop with Austin Batcave, which is an organization here in Austin that teaches writing for children, but they also have workshops for adults. And I took mother's letters from the 1930s when she was at Yale and started transcribing those first, and thinking, how can I make a story out of this? And literally knew nothing about writing. And I wrote business memos. I had no, so, and I just hand this to these other readers to say, well, what do you think? How can this? And they said, well, we don't really see where the arc is. You got to work on this arc thing. What's an arc? But at the time I took the time to transcribe, and then I saw this story about how she didn't graduate from Yale, and she called it the Yale fizzle. And I said, how is this possible? But anyway, fast forward 20 years, I had interns start discovering works. We had transcribed diaries. I started looking at all the guest books and looking at all the names and try to read these names. And now after 20 years, I'm up to 588 names through the letters, the diaries, and the guest books. But it didn't all come together until 2017. I was in Milwaukee, literally stumbled into I intentionally went to the library because I was told that the architecture of the library was fantastic. And so I said, okay, I love beautiful libraries. And it really is a beautiful library with marble. It's gilded. It has art shows. So there was an art show for Wisconsin women artists. And I didn't make anything of it. I was looking at all this art, and my cousin screams across. She says, Claudia, is there another Virginia Hammersmith that paints in Milwaukee? And I said, you're kidding. And so there was this painting, and that was in 2017.
And this was a painting that your mother had painted.
My mother had made in 39, which was the year that she did not graduate from Yale. So she would have finished it, or she had already finished it. I'm not sure this is the painting that actually flunked and got a 69 out of 70. That's all she needed to pass the class. And grandmother just wasn't gonna, it was the Depression. Her great-grandfather had passed away, and he's the one who had funded. And by the way, the book also has a long section in the beginning about Milwaukee and what the art milieu was like in Milwaukee, the conservative approach to things. And mother was, breaking barriers already by working in the museum, volunteering to get her chops to figure out what to do when the war had started, and started learning about how museums operate, how shows happen, and becoming friends with some very strong women in Milwaukee. So the book that I put out is not just a biography, but also has some historical writing by other authors as well, to sort of give it more depth. But anyway, that's sort of the start of the whole thing. And I said, okay, well, 2017. And then I found out that my editor was going to retire in 12 months. I said, well, I better get this going now. And so December 2019, he was going to retire. And so fortunately, I had the content. I just had to then think about, well, where are the arcs? And by now I knew what an arc was. And I just pulled out all the stories that I heard as a child. I was born late in mother's life. She was 40 when I was born. So most of all the book about Germany and such was way before my time. But I always heard stories. I heard stories about these amazing women, like Kikyo Haller in Switzerland, who had this gallery, but she was also in a prison camp prior to that, and how she got out of it and all the artists that she helped. And then Hannah Becker, who mother worked with specifically to help. Then I heard stories about the famous dancer Mary Wigman, who was like our Martha Graham, but survived under the Nazis, but it was forbidden to actually use Jewish dancers or Jewish teachers. And when mother came across her, she was like 65 or 70 pounds. I mean, she was so thin. So, and then, and she tried to get a job. She tried, and she was turned down from that. She tried, and then we talk a lot about the McCarthy era. And I was actually remember that part. I remember Dad talking about how they were interrogated and had to tell on people. And Dad, of course, played ignorant always. But now I actually got to research it. I actually researched exactly what was going on then. And I got to research who Kikyo Haller was and who Hannah Becker was. And by the way, just so people know the heft of this book, it's a good 4-pound tome. And it's every page has photographs of art or people, her photographs or a few other people, but mostly her, it's largely her photography. So she just picked up the camera. She gave up painting, but picked up the camera. So, and then she also wrote. She wrote letters every day. That's what I have in this archive, are her letters and her diaries, justifying what she was doing to her mother, who was very disparaging about the fact that she was always gallivanting around, even though she was helping, but she was not at home.
So she came to Germany in 1946.
In August of 46.
Your father was there working for the Stars and Stripes?
Not yet. He was working for the US government as a designer. That all happened very serendipitously as well. At the end of the war, many people don't know this, but there were not enough ships to come back. Hundreds of thousands of people over there. So you had a lottery system, and the lottery just never picked his number. And so he was sitting literally in France, painting pictures, watercolors the whole time, and got bored. And so I went to Paris and said, maybe there's a class I can take or can do something. And he sees a posting for US government looking for designers. And he literally applied and wrote a telegram to my mom that minute saying, okay, I'm doing this now. Like, no questions asked. I'm doing this now. Mom was trying to get him a job back in the States at some art school or something. And so in the switching back and forth of a few telegrams, it was a done deal. Dad got the job and said, this is the best thing because I can be released in 6 months and come back to the States. That was the idea. But then they stayed 25 years.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. And so she arrives in this world of Germany in 1946. My books are set in 1945. The third one takes place in early 1946. So it's almost like they tag teamed.
Right.
And
they were in the same, and mother wrote a letter about going into the Wiesbaden Museum, which would have been the same position that Anna was in, and mother went by these same secretaries and writes about them. and writes about all the bureaucracy and the actual soldiers playing cards in the front, which is exactly what you write about in your fictionalized. So how do you know that? How did you figure that out?
I don't know. I just made it up. It just seemed like something they would do. I don't know. But there were things that I read, there were very particular details that I picked up here and there. There was the thing that gave me the idea to write my book was, in addition to the Monuments Men documentary, was an article in the Smithsonian Magazine, which actually describes the first shipment of art that came to the collecting point in Wiesbaden on August 21st, 1945. And it described it so vividly that I thought that's a story. That was the Wiesbaden collecting point, as opposed to the different collecting points the Monuments Men had. The Wiesbaden one, which is where my books are set, and the one that your mom visited, had mostly collections that had been hidden and stored, museum collections, mostly from the Berlin State Museums. So they didn't deal so much with Nazi looted art, although some of that sort of came into it. But one of the things that they had in their collection in that first shipment was the bust of Nefertiti, which is written about in the Smithsonian article about how it was this like revelation of, knowing that this piece was safe, it wasn't destroyed, and it gave everybody this great lift. It was just it's a really well-written story. And that was kind of what sparked the book for me. And I thought, I'll write a book around that. And I found some memoirs, and they have these little details in there. And so maybe I got the card playing thing from Walter Farmer, who was the director of the collecting point. Maybe his memoir, he might have said something like that. But also you can just kind of create this world, and you just think like, well, how would people behave? How do people?
Right. Well, and I forgot to. This is one piece that you write about that also comes up, and what Mother discovers is that business about them signing a petition, the Monuments Men signing a petition that the artwork had to come back to Germany because the Americans actually were going to keep it as a restitution, and that was just fantastic. And then it shows up again in stuff.
Well, that was the thing that I started writing the first book around that August 21st, 1945 delivery. And in my research, I found two other big historical events. The second one was this so-called Wiesbaden Manifesto, which the Monuments Men in the Wiesbaden collecting point wrote in protest of the State Department sort of abducting paintings from their collecting point to safeguard in the United States. And the Monuments Men were very much up in arms about this, and said, if we take this art, then we're no better than the Nazis. And, we have no business taking this. And so they wrote a manifesto, and they all signed it, under threat of, being court-martialed. And so that happened in November of 1945. And then the third big event that happened was in February of 1946, which is when the third book takes place. And that was when they actually opened the collecting point up as a museum for the public. And the bust of Nefertiti was on display. And, my mother remembers getting on the train from Darmstadt, which is, the next city over. She and my grandmother got on the train and put on their best clothes, because my grandmother said, we're putting on our best dress because we're going to go see, Queen Nefertiti. And, my mother's like, oh, okay. And she remembered that, but she didn't actually remember any of that until I started researching this. And I was telling her this, and she was like, wait a minute, I went to that. So it's all this amazing, so I wanted to structure the third book around that historical event. So that's the third book.
Excellent. You did a great job. You really did a great job.
You.
Right.
So I've lost my little thread here. So talk about your mom though. your
What's that?
like talk about the situation that your mom found herself in when she arrived in
Well, why don't we show some slides right now of
oh,
the
okay.
pictures of things that I included in the book. There's just a few here that might give
Okay,
some
I'm
people an
gonna
idea
share my
of,
screen and we'll show your slides. Let's see. Okay. Can you
so
see
this is
that?
yep, I can see it. This is
Okay.
on the left is a guest book example and how difficult it was to figure out. And there's my Aunt Mary Lou Hammersmith, who came over to visit. Some of our American family actually came over and visited. But also on the same page are 4 or 5 other artists: Hans Hartung, Hairline, Hoyer. And then on the right is a sample page from the diary, which is really difficult to read. And I actually said, I had somebody in New Jersey who didn't know German, didn't know anything about the story, but wanted to get paid by the page. And I was more than happy to let her do that. And it took still years, it still is not done yet, of actually fixing the transcriptions, because the mother would use German and English in the same sentence. And
Oh, wow.
and it was a terrible speller on top of that. So it's really, it's been one of those things that I can work on forever, and I'll be happy working on it. So and maybe it'll be an addendum at some point.
These were guest books from parties that they had, because they had how many parties?
Right. So in the hundreds, if you combine between the 51, 52 diary telling me about all the parties, and then the actual guest book where people would write on there and doodle. In 1 year, there were over 200 parties. So, and artists would be coming through all the time. Mother had the ability, because she was connected to the Americans, to get people papers. You couldn't move between the zones, but Mother would go and down and this is all letter writing. This is before even the use of the telephone a lot. It was just letter writing, and Mother would go down to the offices and get special papers so that the artists could come through. So why don't you move on to the next page. And this is the painting. This is the painting that was discovered in Milwaukee. And there's my sister and I in complete shock that, and as you can see, it's a big painting and it's quite finished. And it's not an art school sketch. And it's called The Flood. And Mother writes about that whole topic of coming up with a design for this painting throughout her whole career at Yale. I mean, at least 3 other mentionings of the flood from her freshman year on. Keep going. And this is an example of Mother's photography. She took photos of, this is Frankfurt, and that's the Frankfurt Dome. And that's our older sister there, who came over with my mother when she was only 3. And here she's about 4. So this is probably 46, 47. And still, it's still in rubble. The town is still, and you can see everybody's still dressed in their suits. They're just going on their little way. And
Right.
Keep going. And here, this is Hannah Becker. Hannah Becker was the first woman collector that Mother was connected to because of the Monuments Men, because of Captain Edith Standen, who, did you mention that in one of your books at all? Did she mention Edith Standen?
Standen is in the 3rd book, yes.
She's in the 3rd book, yeah. Yes. Well, she was actually a real person, and Mother had asked her who were the collectors in town that she should meet. And Mother and Hannah did have a phone actually, and called her. And Mother came over, and the house was freezing, and they smoked cigarettes from room to room. And here's an example of all the paintings on the wall. I mean, Hannah would, when she was in Berlin in the 30s under the Nazis, she surreptitiously continued to help the artists. She showed them, she purchased from them, she had parties to continue the life, but then she had to quit because she was getting too dangerous. It was really very sad. But and then she came down to Frankfurt. This is the town of Hofheim, which is outside of Frankfurt.
And she was very well known. I mean, I think I told you, my mother knew exactly who she was when I mentioned her name.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And this house, this big house called the Blaue Haus, was also occupied by the armed forces, and they kicked Hannah out and threw all of her letters and correspondence, and fortunately, and lived in her house when she had to go find some other place to live. It scared her to death that something would happen to all this artwork, but nothing did, except there was one little mark on one of the Lehmbruck. Someone put lipstick on it. Yeah, that was the least. She was worried that some of the wood sculptures would be used in the fireplace.
Right, right.
So going, and this is an example of what the zones were broken up. So the U.S. zone's right there in the middle, but Germany, you had all these, you couldn't easily go between them. And so you had to have papers anywhere you wanted. And you couldn't even go to a town and stay in in a hotel, there weren't really many hotels, if any. And so you had to get permission to maybe stay with somebody. And she'd have to get those kinds of, or she'd knock on whoever was, there were all these American soldiers that were in charge of the different towns. And she'd go knock on their door and ask for permission. It was very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Keep going. And these are example of her photography in Berlin. She went up there, and Karl Hofer in his studio. And on the right, Hans Ullmann, example of his sculpture. Next. And this is, mother also commissioned art. She commissioned this artist, Ida Kerkovius, who was originally part of the Bauhaus. And she's a weaver, and she used, this is on the left is a portrait of our dog, Hexie. Abstract portrait, of course, but actually used Hexie's hair.
Oh, wow.
And it really fantastically creative. And on the right is a painting, a portrait of my mother, also done by Ida Kerkovius in 1948.
Love that.
And so the book has many of these examples. And here's a little story here about this little postcard here, which is 2 inches by 3 inches. This artist did very small little work, and mother purchased a piece of his work for equivalent like $20. And another artist in town got wind of the fact that Herr Roth was sold a piece of artwork to an American and reported my mother to the monuments men. It was a very tenuous time, and mother was called in and basically told them, you know, I just have better taste in art than you do. Just leave me alone. And they did. They finally left her alone, because there were a lot of bad players. When you read Jeannen's books, you'll get a sense of how bad some of these villains were in the art world, and things that they would do and try to get away with. I mean, outright thievery. And the monuments had a very difficult job trying to figure out who the good guys were and the bad guys were. And they had long lists. They had long lists of who was accepted and who wasn't. So if an American was doing something wrong, you could easily be shipped back to the States. And my mother stood her ground and said, no, I'm helping those contemporary. This only costs $20. You know, I'm doing more good here. Leave me alone. But she was also best friends with Captain Anastasis, who later took over for Mr. Howard. So she was going to be protected, I think. And she was best friends with his wife, Gladys. So mother made sure she had all the best friends. So this is an example of mother also, you know, her goal was to help the artist recover. So you'll see here in this 2 of these people are State Department people. One of them is a psychiatrist. 2 of them are artists. Hannah Becker is there, and my mother. And so she would arrange for trips to go to different towns. And I don't know if they took the train or whether they carpooled. I'm sure they carpooled, but this is a usual thing for them to do. The mother usually would arrange. And I think this photo was taken by our father. And here's an example of a picture of my mother actually doing her job. This is in our big scrapbook, which, by the way, all these documents are on the fontaine.org website. And this particular photograph is in the scrapbook. So, and every photograph is indexed. So if you come across an historian or such that's looking for a person or a relative that might have known somebody, I very easily might have something that might be of interest to them, whether they're American or German, whether they're a State Department person or whether they're an artist or a writer. Mother was very friendly with all the journalists. AP Newswire, Duluth's head of that was one of their best friends. The journalists for the New York Times, the journalists for the Stars and Stripes, of course, and the women journalists. There were many women journalists that did tremendous work over there. Okay, keep going. I think there's just a couple more. And this is an example of her photography for the dancers, Mary Wigman. Mary Wigman is the woman in the far left, that big black skirt. This is a big workshop she did in Montreux, Switzerland. Mother stayed with them for 2 weeks, drove the entire dance troupe down there, stayed with them and photographed their work, and then tried to sell the photography. When she realized she wasn't going to make a lot of money at it, she had to give it up. But she was right at their side. Is that the last picture? Oh, and then this is the last one of the big arcs of Mother's life, was building collections for other people. So Gordon Gilkey was part of the Monuments Men. And when he left Wiesbaden, went back to the States, he went to Oregon State University and asked our mother to actually develop print shows and have them shipped to the States. And so I have all the correspondence back and forth, and he pretty much gave her carte blanche. So if you want to switch to the next slide, you'll see 3 shows that she did. She did contemporary prints from Germany, 1 and 2, and then also one for Czechoslovakia. And so this last piece was the saddest piece. When she did the Czechoslovakian show, the Russians moved in 1968, literally a week before the prints were being sent out to the States. Fortunately, they did make it out to the States. But Mother was never given credit for doing her work because they were so afraid of having anybody being, any American being tied to something that the Russians could come looking for. Mother felt that was not a very good justification and sort of said, well, I'm ready to do something different now. And my father said, let's go to Mexico. They went to Mexico and she didn't blink an eye. But that's pretty much, yeah. That was her big coup. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. She had an amazing life. I'm going to stop sharing now. Is that your last slide?
Yes, right. But understanding that. So tell me, understanding the time. I didn't know what you learned about the times that was something new that you truly just opened your eyes to what must have been like.
Well, it's interesting because I spent a lot of time in Germany in my childhood. And so I was really sort of, fascinated by the fact that this horrible thing had happened there and nobody talked about it. And everyone I met seemed to be so nice and like, how could this happen? It just became, that was something that I constantly thought about. And so when I had, the idea for the book, I just started doing a lot of research and sort of really put myself in the place and tried to understand what that was like. So I created a whole backstory for Anna to understand what her life had been like during the war up until the day in August of 1945 when the book starts. How did she get there? What was her mindset? And I really, created her as someone who really just wanted life to go back to the way it had been before the war, which was sort of an impossible thing. That's not, couldn't happen. But she really just wanted everything to be back the way it was with her husband and her family. And couldn't we all just kind of, put things back together? And she comes to realize, of course, that she, not only that isn't possible, but that that she has a role to play in rebuilding her life, that she has agency there. And, she's sort of reluctant, but I sort of, wanted her to have this kind of proto-feminist role where she sort of comes into her own. And like I said, I got about halfway through the first book and I realized that I wasn't going to be able to finish it in one book and I was going to have to write some more. But then I came up with that structure. But, the sort of the relationship between her and Cooper, Captain Cooper, who is her boss, the conversations that they have and the tensions that they have are sort of her trying to work out what her place in the world is now after the war. What is she responsible for? How is she supposed to feel? What is she supposed to do? And then he, of course, too, sort of came in like, well, we're the good guys, we're the heroes in this story. And it turns out, well, maybe it's not quite that simple. And, things are not black and white in that way. And so that was really, what I came to understand specifically about the time was just things like how hungry people were and how difficult everything was, and things, the way people had to communicate, and the people were, separated and couldn't find each other, and they would leave signs on doors and on, posts, and at the post office there were bulletin boards of people looking for each other and people giving each other, helping with transportation or looking for transportation to another town because they're looking for someone. And so, like I said to you, like if Anna had just had a decent phone line and a car like this, my whole book would have been pointless. So, I mean, the whole setting just throws up so many obstacles. So I I have some photos too. So I gathered a ton of photos. And just because of my day job, I write about architecture, which means I look at a lot of photos and I sort of describe what is in the photo and how you're supposed to feel about it. And so that's kind of how I write, especially about this time, which obviously I've never experienced myself. So here are a few of my photos. Let me see if I can. Okay, is that?
Yep.
Can you see that? Okay. So I went to Wiesbaden with my mother in 2010. So 11 years ago. I keep joking that when I started this whole thing, my daughter was 2 and she's now 15. So that's how long this takes. But I went and I met with the city archivist in Wiesbaden, and he gave me a ton of photos. This is one of them. He was just so happy that someone was asking about this time and about the monuments men. And, we had a great meeting. And so these are some photos of just kind of what Wiesbaden looked like. Wiesbaden was actually bombed 66 times during the war. And that was it being kind of spared because the Allies wanted Wiesbaden to actually be the Allied headquarters because it's such a beautiful city. But then they realized that it's not a big enough city to sustain all the infrastructure that was needed for the headquarters, and they moved them to Frankfurt. So Wiesbaden was actually spared, but that meant that 25% of the city was destroyed. So these are sort of that's a typical street scene. This is a scene of, this is actually the Americans arriving in Wiesbaden in March of 1945. You can see them, they're walking in from the south. So this is them coming into the city. This is the city over here. And I just love this photo because it's such a little moment in time. You see these little kids, these little boys running behind them, and people standing out here watching to see what's going to happen. And this is actually the street that I ended up putting Anna's house on, just because I really like this location. So this is the street that she lives on, and she walks up this way and goes that way to her job at the collecting point. This is another sort of, just a scene of what she would be walking through daily. It also gave me an idea of which parts of the city were destroyed because it gives me the address there. So I kind of had a good sense of, because I wanted to be as authentic as I could to, describe which parts of the city were destroyed and what they looked like. I also did a ton of research on Google, which has the entire archive of Life magazine photos, which if you ever want to give up, 3 weeks of your life, you could jump in there and not be seen again. So I just love this photo is, these children, these little urchins that are playing with these, I don't know what they are, artillery shells. Just sort of, there are children in my story. There's a little boy, Oscar, and then there's Anna's daughter, Amalia. And so they, kind of run free during this time because there are no schools, and, the parents are busy working or trying to rebuild their lives. And so these were very common scenes. This is another photo that I got from the archives. And this actually shows up in the first book. This is a displaced persons camp. And the woman in the kitchen is wrapping sandwiches in old German maps of France, like military maps of France, which I thought was a really great detail. So, you pick up these little things here and there. So again, just incredible rubble. And, like you said, life just going on amidst the destruction. So this is February 1945.
Well, also, I remember one of the letters, she mentions the smell. The smell was just so bad.
Oh, really?
Of decomposed bodies still underneath that rubble.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, it was really horrific. And, and lack of plumbing and lack of just basics that you had to, that was one piece that you don't get in a photograph, is that.
Yeah, no, you can't get that in the photo. Yeah. This is another one. I just like this photo of this little boy watching the American army and all the trucks. Thought that was a good photo. This is a picture of this is the collecting point in Wiesbaden. This is the Landesmuseum, which is still there. It looks so much exactly like this now. It's a very beautiful building. So this is where the Monuments Men set up and had their collecting point in Wiesbaden. So this is where my character Anna goes to work every day. And at the beginning, it's in very, very bad shape, and they have plumbing issues, and all the windows are shattered, and there's no climate control, and so they have to devise the Monuments Men have to devise a way to keep the humidity up in the rooms, and so they put bowls of water around, and so that was a task to sort of maintain the level of water in these bowls to keep the humidity up, to make sure that the art didn't dry out. So these were all kind of details that I picked up from various sources. So this is a famous picture of the Monuments Men, and I'm showing this because I don't know if anyone saw the movie The Monuments Men, but this person here in the back in the movie was played by Matt Damon. His name is James Rorimer. He was one of the sort of more famous Monuments Men. And one of the things that happened to me writing this is that I actually got to be in contact with his son, Louis, who emailed me out of the blue after having read one of the books. And, he was very complimentary, and it was kind of the most amazing thing, because what Louis didn't know is that James was always my favorite Monuments Man the whole time. So it was really good. So yeah, the Monuments Men were these guys that were, they were not regular military. They were architects, they were art historians, curators, artists in many cases. This one here, if you saw the movie, this is George Stout. He was played by George Clooney. You can tell he's kind of a rakish, kind of a rogue, and he very much lived by his own rules. And
didn't he actually start the entire preservation business? Wasn't that his forte?
Yes, I think so. I think you're right.
Yeah. He's and mother mentions him in some of the dinner parties that he.
Oh, really? I'm sure he always had this revolver. He insisted on wearing the revolver all the time, and people were like, you can let it go, and he wouldn't put it down. So this is Edith Standen right here, and I love this photo because she's got all their attention. Look at them, they're all listening to her. And this is in the collecting point in Wiesbaden. This is the museum. So that was really exciting when I got to visit the museum, to kind of walk through these exact same halls. And there she is again. So this is Edith. This is Rose Vallon, who she was employed at the Jeu de Paume in Paris, which was the museum where the Nazis took all the best pieces of art that they looted from Jewish collectors in Paris, and they put them on display for Hermann Goering to come look at and decide what he wanted for his own collection. But Rose was this very quiet, unassuming, kind of nobody paid any attention to her. And she worked there, and she wrote down every single painting that came through the Jeu de Paume, who it had come from, who owned it, and when it left and where it went. And she wrote this on little scraps of paper, and she put them in a jar, and that was buried in her backyard. And so when the war was over, she took that jar to the Monuments Men, and so they made her a Monuments woman. So this is why she's in uniform, and she did a lot of work with them after the war. And if you saw the movie The Monuments Men, she was played by Cate Blanchett, and so that's Hollywood for you right there. And this is a Monuments Man. I don't know who this is, but obviously. So this is just a picture. Again, this is James Rorimer took this picture of the inside of the collecting point, which is exactly how I always picture it when I'm writing about it. Just these crates and crates of paintings, and just constantly this influx of art, and having to sort of sort through it and figure out what they had and what to do with it, and where was it supposed to go. And so you can see a lot of opportunity for shenanigans, because people caught on to this and were like, wait a minute, there's a lot of valuable stuff there. So they had to devise a system to keep track of it all. And so one of the things they did was every piece of art that came in got a property card. that described what it is. This is the property card for the bust of Nefertiti, which is sort of very, sort of perfunctory description, bust of the queen. And this was the in shipment number 1 right here. That was the August 21st, 1945 shipment, which was 45 trucks of art. And it really kicked off the, the collecting point, and they really understood that they had just millions and millions of dollars worth of valuable art. And the bust of Nefertiti was kind of their centerpiece. This is Kenneth Lindsay. He's a very dapper monuments man. They had the bust of Nefertiti in a crate in the collecting point, and the brass from Frankfurt would have big dinner parties and then come to Wiesbaden and, knock on the collecting point door at midnight and say, we want to see the bust of Nefertiti. And the poor people had to always, and the monuments men hated it. Walter Farber hated it. He just couldn't stand that they were, holding this up as a spoil of war. And he just thought it was so tasteless. And so that's a thing that happens that is also referred to in the first book. So those are all little details that came out in the novels. So that was the world that I created, and I just created these characters and I just set them loose. And so
I just can't wait for your next book. What is it?
Well, it's my next book is about it's about one of the characters, a spin-off of one of the characters in the 3 books, the little boy named Oscar, who was never meant to be in the books, but he showed up and he wouldn't go away. And so now he gets his own book and he's very happy. So it's going to be about 10 or 12 years later, and he's going to be a young man, and he's going to have to deal with some things from his past. So
yeah, that's a really good thing to tackle.
What are you working on? And I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, please feel free to pop it in the Q&A and we'll be happy to answer it. But tell me what you're working on.
Well, I've been working on a memoir in parallel to doing these other 2 books. As I was taking these writing workshops, I would get new information about what I should do. But now that I've gone this far, and I said, you know what? I'm not going to do a memoir. I'm going to make something funny. It's going to be something completely different. And maybe I'll pull some things from my past that are truly outrageous, just because they're really outrageous. Living in 3 different countries, and the generations of German and Army and Mexican and then American, and this little bum that I was.
The good thing about fiction is you can make stuff up. This was one of the critiques I got on my first draft, was apparently I was sort of writing things, very historically accurate.
Right.
And this person was like, you can make stuff up. And I was like, oh, yeah. Right. So yeah, you should do that. That would be.
Well, and I'm going to try to pull out my funny bone. That's what I really want to do. I want to make my funny bone to come apart. This is all so dire. This is just, history is hard. So yeah.
So what we're while we're waiting for some questions, y'all don't have any questions, we'll just keep talking. So what were your particular issues? What challenges did you face when you were writing the book? What was your biggest hurdle that you had to overcome?
We did get a question. Before I answer that, look at the question we have here.
Oh yeah.
Any chance you 2 would consider collaborating on historical fiction treatment of Claudia's mother's story? Huh.
Oh, we should do that.
Just take one of the arcs and go with it.
Yeah, that would be great. Wouldn't that be? She could.
Yeah.
How?
I mean,
when did your mother leave Germany?
69.
Oh yeah, so she was there during the Oscar book.
Yeah.
So she could be in the Oscar book.
one of the drunk parties that where all the women are just so depressed and constantly all those things.
Yeah, Oscar will find himself at those Americans, their parties, and he will
their
find
parties, right?
Yeah.
Right, and not a serious tone in there. Well, here's someone wrote in the chat: when you're writing and creating worlds, do you ever have dreams where your characters or storylines appear?
Well, like I was telling you the other day when I was I was going through the archives at I just want to say that I know that my characters are not real. I know they're not real people, but I was reading through some materials at the archives, and I could see that they were making a mistake. The Monuments Men had made a mistake. They'd let a Nazi art dealer go, and I was reading the documentation on that, and I thought, Cooper, what did you do? And then I was like, John, he's not a real person. First of all, this had nothing to do with him. So I don't actually dream about them, but they do sort of live in my head as if they're real people. I will confess to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my mother's, I pray to her every day. She's still with me.
Yeah. Do you talk to her? I could imagine that she was kind of a forceful personality.
Yeah. Here's a question from Mary Brandel. Who do you each see as your focal audience? Age, gender, nationality, and how does that shape the style of your approach? I'll let you go first.
I just know that here in Texas, I have people who live in the Hill Country who have German ancestry seem to really appreciate the books, and so I love talking to them. And but most of my readers are women, and I would say older women. But I get, looking at my sales, I have sales all over the world, so that's exciting. Which I don't know who those people are, and I don't, but it's I would say it's predominantly women. And what I learned writing the 3 books is that people really, really responded to the relationship between Anna and Cooper, which was not my plan. But again, I just put them in the world, and they didn't, I couldn't control
well,
it.
it's also a conversation between two nationalities, two
Right.
cultures, two histories that they came together and found a way to negotiate each other. And
Right.
that it had to happen. We all have to go through that when we go through wars. So it's just
Right.
in my case, mine's a mishmash, and I never got real clarity, except that I feel that there's not enough people understand what women in the 50s went through, and even in the 40s, because part of Mother's story is also even back in the 40s when she was working in an ammunitions factory, and having power and running a whole team of women, and then working in a museum and having power, and then the men come back from war, and then you don't have power anymore, and then suddenly she tries to get a job, but because she's married, she can't get a job. So I think the audience I'd like to reach would be, it's clearly a coffee table book because it's a lot of pictures. But if people can slow down enough to read some of these letters, they'll get a sense of a voice, and just make the women, our women of the next generations, understand the trials that the prior women went through. So I tried to make and I also include little memoir pieces of my own, how I saw my parents. There's just a few of them, little vignettes. So that in that case, I was trying to reach people who wanted a more personalized understanding of what children of artists go through, how their approach. And yeah, so a little bit of everything for everybody. But because it's a 4-pound coffee table sized book, I'm hoping that it's not just for art historians, it will also be for families.
It's a great story. Your book is
and also the family. There's so many characters in here. I'm hoping that some relations of some of these people will pop up and say, "Oh, that's my mom."
Oh, that would be amazing. That would be so great.
No, that's one of my marketing efforts, is actually to go through my 588 people and find their children.
Look out, they're all going to get emails. So
okay,
Mary Bauman is asking about The Rape of Europa, the book. That's actually, and that documentary, that's actually the documentary that I saw on PBS that I happened to stumble on that started this whole thing. So yeah, the book is excellent. The documentary is excellent. The Monuments Men movie is, I feel, kind of oversimplifies the story. It sort of turns it into this kind of heist movie. It was very entertaining, and it's certainly, I will say that I was working on my book while that movie was being filmed, and was finishing it as the movie was starting. The previews were starting to come out in theaters, and so I went from like 2 years of people going, "Oh, what is your book about?" And I would say, "Oh, do you know about the Monuments Men?" And they would say no, and then I would talk about the Monuments Men, and then all of a sudden those previews started coming out, and I would say, "Do you know about the Monuments Men?" And they said yes. They would say yes, it's that movie that George Clooney's making. I'm like, thank you, George, that really helps. So it certainly raised the awareness of the Monuments Men, and there's a whole lot more information now out than there was even when I started researching. So but The Rape of Europa is a fantastic documentary. I can highly recommend.
Absolutely. Well, we're almost at an hour, just 1 minute shy. If anybody else doesn't, please email us, continue to email us, go to fontaine.org, sign up for our newsletters. Also, Kanan also does, do you do blogs, Kanan? Jana?
No, no, I'm on Facebook though. You can find me at C.F Yetmen on Facebook. That's probably where I'm most active. And of course, you can buy the books at Bookwoman, so please stop by there and
or go online and buy it there.
Give them some of your money. And Claudia, you're going to be at the Texas Book Festival.
That's right. So
that's in October.
They haven't officially released the list, but if you want to verify it, I can give you someone's email. But I'm not lying. They have a
secret, was it?
I don't think so. And any minute now, it's not going to be a secret anymore. But all you all that are listening, keep it under wraps.
Keep it under. Don't. Yeah. Sorry. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I promise I won't say anything.
No.
Okay.
Thank everybody. Thank you for coming. It's been a lot of fun. And also, if you have a book club that you would like us to participate in, email us about that. Or if there's other opportunities you think that people would like to listen to our story, whether it's a book club or a library, some libraries might want to have an event. We'd be more than happy to do that, because I think if this is as fun as it is today, we'll take it on the road.
Yeah,
why not?
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, because all of you all are coming from different parts of the country, so I know there must be other book clubs and such around like this.
Yes, we do book clubs. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and yeah, let's do it again.
Okay, all right, bye.
All right, good night.
Good night.